Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 277. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com. We're honored to have with us the award-winning and internationally acclaimed author and journalist, David Goodman.
It's great to be with you, Barney.
So I reached out to you, David, because I know that you have you do a podcast that's connected to VT Digger, which is one of the premier news outlets that we have here in Vermont, and you also simultaneously stream this podcast through WDEV out of Waterbury, correct?
Right. Yes.
And I was, and one of the aspects of it, because, doing my research, you're a man of many hats. Not only are you considered, the godfather of backcountry skiing, you also do there's a lot of good education that you do on the dangers of autocracies, which was another one of the things that one of your passions about. Before we kind of dive into just really talking about how you write and the difference between journalism and writing guidebooks, do you want to give people a little bit of background on how you got into journalism and then also in writing?
Yeah. Well, I really have my high school newspaper, Bayshore High School on Long Island, and its school newspaper, the Maroon Echo. That's really where I got my beginning. Although, if I'm to be honest, it predates that, something called Dave's Press, which was my publication chronicling the goings-on of my family. And I had as subscribers our extended family and some neighbors. My grandfather, there were letters to the editor. This I started at age 7. And I was using a rudimentary copying machine that a neighbor who was an accountant, who was modern enough to have this little heat sensor copying machine where you pressed the heat sensitive paper on one side. It was quite a labor intensive process. But my grandfather wrote in to complain that I was charging for subscriptions more than Newsweek. I think it was $5 a year. And he pointed out that Newsweek was only $3. So I was quite resistant to being shamed by anybody, not the least my grandfather. And I just simply I used the pages to shame my subscribers who had fallen in arrears, including my grandfather. So if I'm really to be honest, that is the roots of my journalism. In high school, I was very involved in my high school newspaper, which was kind of a bright spot in the school. It was a perfectly good high school, but the newspaper was a national award-winning paper, which was kind of a curiosity. And but it nevertheless kind of gave me the bug. And I, interestingly, did not do journalism in college, but returned to it immediately upon graduating and began freelance writing, and I have never stopped. So I graduated college in 1983, and I just started freelancing around Boston and writing for publications there, Boston Magazine. I was also an Outward Bound instructor in the summers, so the outdoors was my passion. And then I had done a story about the renaissance of backcountry skiing in the mid 80s for Cross Country Skier magazine, because it blended my passion. I was a history major in college, so it blended my passion for history, for outdoor adventure, and for telling stories. So it was sort of a historical piece about how there was a heyday of backcountry skiing in the 1930s. It went away and it was coming back there in the 80s. And right at that moment, the Appalachian Mountain Club was interested in doing a guidebook, its first skiing guidebook in a half century, and got my name, and thus began a sort of almost accidental authorship of what has come to be known as the Backcountry Skiing Bible, the only backcountry skiing guidebook to the Northeast, which I've done now 5 of them. So there's that. But I have, was very involved in politics and activism in college and continued to be. Also wrote a book about South Africa's transformation from apartheid that came out in 1999 called Fault Lines. And so I have just continued to do both. And, I tell people that's the free and freelance. You are free to pursue. Maybe nobody else sees the connection, but it makes sense to you.
So I'm really curious as well, because a part of it, as you mentioned, like the backcountry skiing adventures books that you come out, if I remember hearing in a previous interview, you kind of update that every 10 years or so as well?
I do. The most recent one came out in 2020. If you told the 20-something David Goodman that this book that he was doing almost as a lark, I mean, when I got a call asking, they wanted to pay me, not much, but a little, to ski and write about it, I would have laughed. And if you told me I would be doing it 30 plus years later, 5 editions later, I would have wondered what you were smoking. So this, as I say, has been kind of an accidental, but I love it. And I think the thing that I love about writing about skiing in the Northeast, one is its rich history. It is the story of New England. It's the story of how New England rural communities were settled. And 2, it's also about community. It's a way that people come together. And especially in recent times and during COVID, we saw just an incredible explosion in interest. And I think it's because people were really struggling for ways to come together that was safe, and they found it in the outdoors, and in winter they found it on skis. So I also, for me, it doesn't. It still includes my passion for social justice issues and environmental issues. Skiers are the canary in the coal mine for climate change, and I do include in all of my books an invocation that if you ski and you love to ski, our habitat is threatened by climate change, and you need to be active to do anything you can to address those issues. So it all makes sense to me. It represents all the things I'm interested in.
So as a writer, how different have you seen being able to see the different evolutions of that guidebook? Has it been a journey for you also to not necessarily see how the genre and the subject that matter that you're writing about has changed and evolved? You mentioned in another interview how Maine now is getting a larger backcountry skiing.
Nothing stands still. I mean, as a guidebook author, it would make my life really easy if it did. I wouldn't have to go re-ski everything and research everything. Not that that's a hardship, but you do cover a lot of ground. The story of skiing, again, tracks with the story of conservation and environmentalism in the Northeast. You mentioned, in the very first edition of my backcountry skiing guidebook, which was called Classic Backcountry Skiing, came out in 1988. There wasn't a ton of backcountry skiing in Maine. Maine is intensively logged. And so finding, forest and mountainsides that weren't being plundered wasn't easy. But in the latest edition, Maine has been the site of the largest conservation effort in the Northeast, called the Maine Woods Initiative by the Appalachian Mountain Club, where they have purchased and conserved over 100,000 acres for many miles around Baxter Park, where Mount Katahdin is. And the result of that is this beautiful hut-to-hut skiing network that I've written about for the New York Times and elsewhere. So Maine has actually, 30, 40 years after I started this, has come to be a real gem in the landscape of backcountry recreation.
how often do you go back and read some of your previous editions, and have you seen an evolution in even your writing style since '88?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Barney, because I am constantly, when I'm writing new versions, I am editing the 28-year-old version of myself. Fortunately, I mostly like the way that I wrote then. I mean, I do, I'm updating the information, but I do find that I keep, kind of the heart and soul of it. And while I hope my writing improves, like everything we hope in our lives improves about us, but I'm okay with, what I was saying and how I was saying it back in my 20s. So I actually enjoy reading my early writing, whether it's about politics or about the outdoors. There's an excitement, there's a freshness that comes through. And, I think one of the things that happens as you do something for a long time is it can be harder to get that excitement and freshness in your voice. You sort of develop a more professional voice and, do all the things that grown-ups do to be accepted in the world. So when I see the sort of unfiltered me, I kind of think, well, I'm lucky to have that, to work with. I don't have to smooth out the edges.
Right. And so because you have such diverse subjects that you've worked on over the years, is there any specific ones that you feel that you're more passionate about that kind of recharges you? And there are other subjects that you actually utilize as kind of like a break in a sense, like I just need to relax a bit. This is write something to recharge myself again.
I don't think I can ever be too impassioned. I think if I'm in that space, I'm in the right place.
Right.
I think, if anything, the opposite is the thing that I try and avoid, which is becoming where the passion doesn't come through. I mean, that for me, that little spark, that candle is, I feel like my whole life,
Mm.
I have done what I can to keep that thing burning hot, and stay in the place where I feel that inspiration, that excitement, or in the case of politics and the world, the outrage, the indignation. So I try to go to those places. As far as where I go to relax, that would be the outdoors. Even though some of these are pretty exciting, high and wild places, it's where I go to find peace. When I need to kind of recharge, I go to the mountains, and I live in the mountains, so there's no coincidence about why I'm here. Um, and it was funny during COVID as Vermont experienced this land rush, I call it, of folks from the cities moving here and discovering, what I think many of us discovered long ago, which is it's a good place for the soul as well as for the mind and the heart.
How for those that might be watching or listening that also might be writing and doing some other projects, what advice could you give them on how to diversify your time in the sense, because you do a podcast, you're also a freelance journalist, and you're also writing books. How do you balance your energy and your creativity and making sure that you're able to do everything successfully?
Well, yeah, I kind of do it all at once. It's sort of what I do. I mean, I don't know, it's sort of like saying, asking a carpenter, how do you build houses, remodel kitchens, and, do all the things a carpenter does. And I do actually have high praise for carpenters. I do feel like I'm kind of building a house, and it has to be sturdy and beautiful and be pleasing to look at, or in my case, to read. Um, I don't really draw lines. It's all kind of just part of a continuous process and creative process. I really enjoy the doing the Vermont Conversation, the weekly podcast and radio program, because it is a different medium, and I'm getting to interact with people like you. And it's, I enjoy conversations. I've always enjoyed them. I guess that's why I'm a journalist. So this is an opportunity to, and Vermont Digger gives me enormous freedom to talk to and about whatever I want. So I just consider that the greatest gift, and I hope that it's as enjoyable for people to listen to, because I am enjoying, and it can be a mix of challenging people, whether it's politicians holding people in power to account, or just exploring somebody's passion about something. I feel a responsibility to give a voice to people who don't have a voice, who don't have access to power. And, some of the Vermont conversations I'm proudest of are where I do that. Last year, gave an exclusive interview to a transgender student in Randolph High School who had been the subject of a national anti-trans attack. And this student never spoke up, was trying desperately to avoid being the target. And then somebody reached out to me to say this student who called themselves Rabbit would like to talk, would like to tell their story. And I felt, honored that they reached out to me, but also really moved by their bravery to finally speak up at great risk themselves. This is a 14-year-old young person who was, I had to say at one point in the program to remind listeners, you're listening to a 14-year-old here. This person with all this wisdom and experience has so much to teach us. So things like that, and talking to people who are living close to the edge and unhoused. I feel like that's when I'm doing my best work, when I'm giving a platform to people who wouldn't have a platform otherwise. So, I feel that's my responsibility. I sort of trace that back to when I wrote a book about South Africa under its transformation from apartheid. That grew out of, I was in college an anti-apartheid activist in the 80s. And at that time, the only thing we ever said about South Africa was to boycott it. And then after college, my then girlfriend, now wife, and I talked about traveling there. And I went to the representative of the African National Congress, that's Nelson Mandela's political party. It was banned in South Africa, but there was a representative in Boston, and I knew him, Temba Vilakazi. And I said, kind of sheepishly, so I kind of would like to go to South Africa, the place we're always saying boycott. And I said, what do you think? And he replied very quickly. He said, he says, I can't get in. I can't go there. He said, but you can. And if you go there, you have a responsibility to tell people what you see. So I have kind of taken that my whole life, that I have a responsibility to tell people what I see when I go to places that perhaps others can't go, whether it's the top of a wild mountain in winter or, a shanty town in South Africa. I still try and bring back those voices.
And that was your book, Fault Lines, correct?
Yes, Fault Lines: Journeys into the New South Africa.
Regarding your podcast, how do you choose what guests come on, and how do you kind of balance importance of making sure that the story seems to be historical in nature, some of it capturing the moment, and some of it trying to be evergreen?
It's up to me who I choose to have on. I am a voracious news hound, so I am always reading, and things that catch my interest and that I think would be of interest to an audience, I alternate. Oftentimes I'm doing things that have a Vermont connection. Oftentimes I'm not, doesn't have a Vermont connection. I guess the thing is, it needs to be important, needs to be relevant, needs to perhaps tell people something they don't know, or tell people something they do know in a new way or with a unique voice. I don't really have rules around it. And Vermont Digger and WDEV don't place any rules on me. So that's an enormous amount of trust. And I deeply appreciate that. And so far, the things I find interesting, it seems other people find interesting to listen to. So therein lies the sweet spot. And I just keep continuing to, try to follow my nose and seek out voices that perhaps aren't getting the airtime that they could get. So when I listen, I'm also a big listener of podcasts. And I always tell people, when you listen to the Daily, the New York Times podcast, which is, I believe, the most popular podcast in the world, I always tell people, make sure you listen at the end to what I call the cast of thousands. The producers, the sound design people, the editors, the fact checkers. And mine is very short. It's me, and I have one editor, and that's it. So mine is an example of what you can do with a lot of curiosity and determination, and a lot of trust that's given to me by the people who I work with.
So you bring up the editor piece. How important is an editor to a writer?
Oh boy, a great question. I feel like in my life, I've had very few, I won't even say good editors. I mean, in the budget cutting that's going on in the world of journalism, sadly, editors, whose name you don't see, that great article you read or listen to, you don't necessarily hear who edited it. Sadly, editors are often the ones getting cut. They are, overworked. And the result of that is they don't edit. They'll kill a story if they think it needs more work than they have time and energy to have. But I love good editing. I love somebody making my work better. I love collaborating, really, and I've done a lot of collaborations, writing books with other people. So I really enjoy the collaboration process, and I really am sorry that I don't get enough of it because, boy, I feel like I can write a good first draft, but a good editor can just really make it sing. And it's not that often that I have the opportunity. It's also, an issue of trust, an editor trusting you that to tell the story well and to know that you can do it. And, places are just so understaffed right now that step is sadly being eliminated.
So how often do you do collaborations on other works?
I've done a lot of book collaborations. I've written 4 books with my sister, Amy Goodman, who hosts Democracy Now! I just have finished 2 other books. One, I had 4 co-authors. It's called The Community Schools Revolution. And there was an education book I did before that with Mark Warren, a professor at UMass Boston of politics and education. So those collaborations are, people come to me, and if it's of interest to me and I like the person and feel like it's a tricky thing. It's not easy. It's a kind of, I won't say marriage, but it's kind of is for a period of time. So you're going to be really closely tethered to that person and to that topic, living, eating, and breathing it. So you want to make sure that it is something and someone who you're up for being bound tightly to. The book I just had come out this week, The Community School Revolution, was a 2-year-long project. I love my co-authors on this. I think what really makes it work is at its best, a collaboration work. It's working where, a collaboration involves passing something back and forth between yourselves. And to me, it's really singing when it's getting better on each pass. Sometimes you're fighting over it, and it's not necessarily getting better. You're just like fighting and arguing. I try and see that coming and avoid it. But when you can do that thing where, like a tennis match, where each time your stroke is getting better and stronger and more accurate because the person you're playing with is sort of setting you up to succeed, that's the sweet spot of collaboration.
So when you talk about some of these books that you've done collaboration with, do you like write a section to say, hey, David, we want you to write this is your topic, write about this? Or is your authorship kind of interweaved throughout the entire book?
Everyone is different. Sometimes you are each individually writing sections and then swapping and editing one another. Sometimes you have independent authorship of large sections, and sometimes you're just trying to. I would say that just writing together, sitting side by side, and arguing over words, that's the worst. And I've done that. So I've done that, and I know not to do that. So I've kind of done every variation on this. And for me, at least, when a writer has the freedom to write and to speak in their voice and to tell a story, that's really optimal. You're letting them do their thing. So I try and structure the collaborations to where we're both doing that. We're all enjoying doing the thing we love to do and that we hopefully do well.
And so how important is it compared to your journalism aspects of things where things seem to be specifically timely and newsworthy? How important is that when you actually do long form books, doing some level of prose or guidebooks, that there has to be a sense of evergreen to them in order to make sure that they actually last longer as compared to some journalism pieces?
That's a good question in that, sometimes you're not that, when I'm telling the story of South Africa's transformation from apartheid, it's a pretty I have to assume that's a story people will be interested in for a long time just because it's a historic event. When my sister and I are writing about current events, the Bush administration, the Iraq War, that is a lot of people are interested because they're passionate about it at that moment. So that's a whole nother opportunity to engage with readers. So each one kind of they're doing similar things, but there's, the urgency of writing about current event helps one, and the evergreen nature of historical ones helps another. And then there's skiing, which hopefully people always are interested in.
True. Yeah, absolutely. Because almost to the point, have you ever thought about doing the similar format you're doing with your backcountry skiing by having like a second edition, a third edition to revisit? Have you ever thought doing that with some of the books that you wrote earlier that were considered current events, now looking at them through a historical lens instead of writing them as they were happening?
Well, yes, but it kind of, you have to make sure, it may just deserve another book. If I were to write a book about South Africa now, which is, 25 years after the first book, it's really another book. It's not just another chapter. So there's always an opportunity to tell new stories about a place. You don't just have to add to the old ones, and deciding when it deserves, a fresh treatment from the ground up is part of a writer's craft.
How different? Because you mentioned before you're proud of the fact that you're a freelance writer. How has freelance writing changed and evolved since you started doing it in the late 90s?
It's harder now, which is sort of a funny thing to say because there's many more outlets. There's all the online things, but I think what I began doing as a 20-something, supporting myself as a freelance writer, is harder to do now. So I don't know if I could just start out and do now what I started out doing in my 20s, which isn't to say people shouldn't do it. One should follow their dream. And if they can figure out a way to make it work for them and sustainable for them, by all means do it. But I think it's just harder. My friends who I've my fellow freelance writers, and many of us are, communicate with one another. It's kind of important in that, if you work for a publication or in a newsroom, you have colleagues to talk to. I at one time was very involved in the National Writers Union, which is a union of freelance writers, just as a way to have community as well as to, protect our rights and the working conditions that writers have. So we talk, and when I talk to my colleagues now, a lot of the people who started out with me doing what I do are no longer doing this. It's hard to make it sustainable, I think, now. But I feel lucky that I can still do this.
What advice would you give somebody in their 20s who wants to get into freelance writing?
Follow your passion. Your best writing, your best reporting is about something you care about and are passionate about. Don't do just one thing. You could easily make the opposite argument. Be a specialist, be an expert. That'll keep you in demand. For me, not being a specialist, writing about everything from politics to skiing, that's been my thing. That has worked for me. So I tend to tell people what worked for me is, and don't have all your eggs in one basket. Certainly in the publishing world, it's a pretty crazy time. Publications that have been around for over 100 years are going under. So just being nimble, being able to move, and keep moving forward in the things that you love to do is important. And also exploring different ways to do it. I've been a journalist working for UNICEF, traveling to conflict zones, reporting on situation for women and children in places like Sudan and Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire. And that's also been a really amazing part of my life, is continuing to go to remote places and tell those stories that I find there. Talking to child soldiers in Liberia and how they try and rebuild a life. So I've had a lot of opportunities to do a lot of really interesting reporting.
Is there any genres of writing that you still want to explore, whether it be like children's books or other like fiction novels or anything?
Yes, I would be very interested to have the opportunity. I have been thinking a lot about going back to the community where I grew up on Long Island and maybe telling some of the stories of what happened there. There's, it's a very interesting history, civil rights, and other things I maybe didn't understand when I was growing up there, but kind of exploring that. So it's not memoir, but it's sort of memoir-ish, to go back and explore things that happened to me and to my family and to make sense of them now. So that's on my mind. It would be fun. It's whether I can interest other publications or publishers, but I haven't really put the idea out there yet. So it may yet happen.
Right. So David, if people want to learn more about your work, where's the best place they could go to?
So dgoodman.net is my website. And you can see a lot of my writing there, or you can go to VT Digger and find the Vermont Conversation, and there's new episodes every week. And my Twitter is David Goodman VT. So I'll often be reporting about stories. So yep, there's where you get to see what I'm doing in real time. So those are some of the places. And Best Backcountry Skiing is my website for my skiing.
Well, thank you very much, David. As I say, I've been looking forward to chatting with you for months now, and I'm so glad that we're able to connect.
Likewise, Barney. It's been great to talk with you.
Now, how was it? Let me timestamp this. This is what I love about this, David. I can just timestamp all day long, and then as you know, as somebody that also podcasts, anyway, you can do is just like edit it and makes it sound like you're just like super smooth the whole time. That's what I love about it.